Johnny Ludlow, first series by Mrs. Henry Wood. Johnny Ludlow, first series, 1874, consists of 26 short, self-contained stories. Each chapter explores different events, mysteries, and social issues, with Johnny Ludlow either observing or participating. You can enjoy each story individually, making this series perfect for watching one chapter at a time. Part 9, Chapter 17, Breaking Down. Have him here a bit. Oh, but would you like it? Like it, retorted the squire. I know this. If I were a hard-worked London clerk, ill for want of change and rest, and I had friends living in a nice part of the country, I should feel it uncommonly hard if they did not invite me. I'm sure it is very kind of you to think of it, said Mrs. Todditley. Write at once and ask him, said the squire. They were speaking of a Mr. Marks. He was a relation of Mrs. Todditley's, a second or third cousin. She had not seen him since she was a girl, when he used sometimes to come and stay at her father's. He seemed not to have got on very well in life, was only a clerk on a small salary, was married and had some children. A letter now and then passed between them and Mrs. Todditley, but no other acquaintanceship had been kept up. About a month before this, Mrs. Todditley had written to ask how they were going on, and the wife in answering, for it was she who wrote, said her husband was killing himself with work, and she quite believed he would break down for good unless he had a rest. We heard more about it later. James Marks was clerk in the great financial house of Brown and Company. Not particularly great as to reputation, for they made no noise in the world, but great as to their transactions. They did a little banking in a small way, and had mysterious money dealings with no end of foreign places. But if you had gone into their counting house in London, you'd have seen nothing to show for it, except Mr. Brown seated at a table desk in a small room, and half a dozen clerks, or so, writing hard, or bending over columns of figures in a larger one. Mr. Brown was an elderly little gentleman in a chestnut wig, and the company existed only in name. James Marks had been thrown on the world when he was 17, with a good education, good principles, and a great anxiety to get on in life. He had to do it, for he had only himself to look to. And mind you, I have lived long enough to learn that that's not at all the worst thing a young man can have. When some friends of his late father's got him into Brown and Company's house, James Marks thought his fortune was made. That is, he thought he was placed in a position to work up to one. But no, here he was, getting on for 40 years of age, and with no more prospect of fortune or competency either than he had had at the beginning. How many clerks, and especially bankers' clerks, are there in that city of London now who could say the same, who went into their house, whatsoever it may be, in the heyday of youth, exulting in their good luck in having obtained the admission for which so many others were striving? They saw not the long years of toil before them, the weary days of close work, with no rest or intermission, except Sunday. They saw not the struggle to live and pay. They saw not themselves middle-aged men, with a wife and family, hardly able to keep the wool from the door. It was James Marks's case. He had married, and what with having to keep up the appearance of gentle people, at least to make a pretense at it, and to live in a decent-looking dwelling, and to buy clothes, and to pay doctors' bills and children's schooling, I'll leave you to guess how much he had left for luxuries out of his 200 a year. When expenses were coming upon him thick and fast, Marks sought out some night employment. A tradesman in the neighborhood, Pimlico, a butterman doing a flourishing business, advertised for a bookkeeper to attend 2 or 3 hours in the evening. James Marks presented himself and was engaged. It had to be done in secrecy, lest offense should be taken at headquarters. Had the little man in the chestnut wig heard of it, he might have objected to his clerk keeping any books but his own. Shut up in the butterman's small back closet that he called his counting house, Mr. Marks could be as private as need be. So there he was, after coming home from his day's toil, instead of taking recreation, the home-sitting with his wife, or the stroll in the summer weather, in place of throwing work to the winds and giving his brain rest, James Marks, after snatching a meal, tea and supper combined, went forth to work again, to weary his eyes with more figures and his head with casting them up. He generally managed to get home by 11 except on Saturday, but the day's work was too much for any man. Better for him, could he have pocketed pride and gained over Brown and Company, that he had hired himself to stand behind the evening counter and serve out the butter and cheese to the customers. It would at least have been a relief from the accounts. And so the years had gone on, A portion of the wife's letter to Mrs. Todditley had run as follows. Thank you very much for your kind inquiries after my husband, and for your hope that he is not overworking himself. He is, but I suppose I must have said something about it in my last letter. I am ashamed to remember that it was written 2 years ago that induced you to refer to it. That he is overworking himself, I have known for a long time, and things that he has said lately have tended to alarm me. He speaks of sometimes getting confused in the head. In the midst of a close calculation, he will suddenly seem to lose himself, lose memory and figures and all, and then he has to leave off for some minutes, close his eyes, and keep perfectly still, or else leave his stool and take a few turns up and down the room. Another thing he mentions, that the figures dance before his eyes in bed at night, and he is adding them up in his brain as if it were daytime and reality. It is very evident to me that he wants change and rest. And what a foolish fellow he must have been not to take it before this, cried the squire, commenting on parts of the letter, while Mrs. Todditley wrote. Perhaps that is what he has not been able to do, sir, I said. Not able? Why, what do you mean, Johnny? It is difficult for a banker's clerk to get holiday. Their work has to go on all the same. Difficult. When a man's powers are breaking down. Do you think bankers are made of flint and steel, not to give their clerks holiday when it is needed? Don't you talk nonsense, Johnny Ludlow. But I was not so far wrong after all. There came a letter of warm thanks from Mr. Marks himself in answer to Mrs. Todditley's invitation. He said how much he should have liked to accept it and what great good it would certainly have done him, but that upon applying for leave he found he could not be spared. So there seemed to be an end of it, and we hoped he would get better without the rest, and rub on as other clerks have to rub on. But in less than a month he wrote again, saying he would come if the squire and Mrs. Todditley were still pleased to have him. He had been so much worse as to be obliged to tell Mr. Brown the truth, that he believed he must have rest, and Mr. Brown had granted it to him. It was the Wednesday in Passion Week, and a fine spring day, when James Marks arrived at Dyke Manor. Easter was late that year. He was rather a tall man, with dark eyes and very thin hair. He wore spectacles, and at first was rather shy in manner. You should have seen his delight in the change. The walks he took, the enjoyment of what he called the sweet country. Oh, he said one day to us, yours must be the happiest lot on earth. No forced work, your living assured. Nothing to do but to revel in this health-giving air. Forgive my freedom, Mr. Todditley, he added a moment after. I was contrasting your lot with my own. We were passing through the fields towards the court. The squire was taking him to see the Sterlings, and he had said he would rather walk than drive. The hedges were breaking into green. The fields were yellow with buttercups and cowslips. This was on the Monday. The sun shone, and the breeze was soft. Mr. Marks sniffed the air as he went along. 6 months of this would make a new man of me, we heard him say to himself in a low tone. Take it, cried the squire. Mr. Marks laughed, sadly enough. You might as well tell me, sir, to take heaven, he said impulsively. The one is no more in my power than the other. Hark! I do believe that's the cuckoo. We stood to listen. It was the cuckoo, sure enough, for the first time that spring. It only gave out 2 or 3 notes, though, and then was silent. How many years it is since I heard the cuckoo, he exclaimed, brushing his hand across his eyes. More than 20, I suppose. It seems to bring back my youth to me. What a thing it would be for us, sir, if we could only go to the mill that grinds people young again. The squire laughed. It is good of you to talk of age, Marks. Why, I must be nearly double yours, he added, which of course was random speaking. I feel old, Mr. Todditley, perhaps older than you do. Think of the difference in our mode of life. I, tied to a desk for more hours of the 24 than I care to think of, my brain ever at work. You reveling in this beautiful, healthy freedom. Well, it is a difference when you come to think of it, said the squire soberly. I must not repine, returned Marks. There are more men in my case than in yours. No doubt it is well for me, he continued, dropping his voice with a sigh. Were your favored lot mine, sir, I might find so much good in it as to forget that this world is not our home. Perhaps it had never struck the squire before how much he was to be envied, but Marks put it strongly. You'd find crosses and cares enough in my place, I can tell you, Marks, of one sort or another. Johnny here, knows how I am bothered sometimes." "No doubt of it," replied Marx with a smile. "No lot on earth can be free from its duties and responsibilities, and they must of necessity entail care. That is one thing, Mr. Todditley, but to be working away your life at high pressure, and to know that you are working it away, is another." "You acknowledge, then, that you are working too hard, Marx," said the squire. "I know I am, sir, but there's no help for it. It is a pity. Why it should begin to tell upon me so early I don't know. There are numbers of other men who work as long and as hard as I do, and are seemingly none the worse for it. The time will come, though, when they will be, I presume, as surely as that sun is shining in the sky. Possibly you have been more anxious than they, Marx. It may be so. My conscience has always been in my work to do it efficiently. I fear, too, I am rather sensitively organized as to nerves and brain. Upon those who are so, I fancy work tells sooner than on others." The squire put his arm within Marx's. "You must have a bit of a struggle to get along, too, on your small salary." "True, and it all helps. Work and struggle together are not the most desirable combination. But for being obliged to increase my means by some stratagem or other, I should not have taken on the additional evening's work." "How long are you at it now?" "Of an evening, usually about 2 hours. On Saturdays and at Christmas time longer." "And I suppose you must continue this night work?" "Yes. I get £50 a year for it, and I assure you I should not know how to spare £1 of the 50. No one knows the expenses of children, except those who have to look at every shilling before it can be spent." There was a pause. Mr. Marx stooped, plucked a cowslip, and held it to his lips. "Don't you think, Marx," resumed the squire, in a confidential, friendly tone, "that you were just a little imprudent to marry?" "No, I do not think I was," he replied slowly, as if considering the question. "I did not marry very early. I was 28, and I had got together the wherewithal to furnish a house, and something in hand besides. The question was mooted among us at Brown's the other day, whether it was wiser or not for young clerks to marry. There is a great deal to be urged both ways, against marrying and against remaining single." "What can you urge against remaining single?" "A very great deal, sir. I feel sure, Mr. Todditley, that you can form no idea of the miserable temptations that beset a young fellow in London. Quite half the London clerks, perhaps more, have no home to go to when their day is over. I mean no parents' home. A solitary room, and no one to bear them company in it. That's all they have. Perhaps, in addition, a crabbed landlady. Can you blame them very much if they go out and escape this solitude? They are at the age, you know, when enjoyment is most keen, the thirst for it well-nigh irrepressible. And then they go off to those disreputable singing places," exploded the squire, not allowing him to finish. "Singing places, yes, and other places. Theaters, concerts, supper-rooms. Oh, I cannot tell you a tithe of the temptation that meets them at every turn and corner. Many and many a poor young fellow, well-intentioned in the main, has been ruined both in pocket and in health by these snares, led into them at first by dangerous companions. Surely all do not get led away. Not all. Some strive on manfully, remembering early precepts and taking God for their guide, and so escape. But it is not the greater portion who do this. Some marry early and secure themselves a home. Which is best? I put the question only in a worldly point of view. To commit the imprudence of marrying, and so bring on themselves and wives intolerable perplexity and care, or to waste their substance in riotous living. I'll be shot if I know, cried the squire, taking off his hat to rub his puzzled head. It's a sad thing for poor little children to be pinched, and for men like you to be obliged to work yourselves to shatters to keep them. But as to those others, I'd give 'em all a night at the treadmill. Johnny Ludlow. Yes, sir. You may be thankful that you don't live in London. I have been thinking to myself that I was thankful not to be one of those poor young clerks to have no home to go to when work was over. Some fellows would rather tramp up and down the streets than sit alone in a solitary room. And the streets, according to Marx, teemed with temptations. He resumed, In my case, I judged it the reverse of imprudence to marry, for my wife expected a fairly good fortune. She was an only child, and her father had realized enough to live quietly. say 300 or 400 a year. Mr. Stockley had been a member of the stock exchange, but his health failed and he retired. Neither I nor his daughter ever doubted. No, nor did he himself, that this money must come to us in time. And won't it? Cried the squire. Mark shook his head. I fear not. A designing servant that they had got over him after his daughter left. He was weak in health and weak in mind, and he married her. Caroline, my wife, resented it naturally. There was some recrimination on either side, and since then they have closed the door against her and me. So you see, with no prospect before us, there's nothing for me but to work the harder, he concluded, with a kind of plucked-up cheerfulness. But, to do that, you should get up your health and strength, Marks. You must, you know. What would you do if you broke down? Hush, came the involuntary and almost affrighted answer. Don't remind me of it, sir. Sometimes I dream of it, and cannot bear to awaken. We had got to like Marks very much only in those few days. He was a gentleman in mind and manners, and a pleasant one into the bargain, though he did pass his days adding up figures and was kept down by poverty. The squire meant to keep him for a month, 2 months if he would stay. On the following morning, Tuesday, during breakfast time, a letter came for him by the post, the first he had had. He had told his wife she need not write to him, wanting to have all the time for idle enjoyment, not to spend it in answering letters. From home, James? Asked Mrs. Todhitley. No, said he, smiling. It is only a reminder that I am due tomorrow at the house. What house? Cried the squire. Our house, sir. Brown and Company S. The squire put down his buttered roll, for Molly had graciously sent in hot rolls that morning, and stared at the speaker. What on earth are you talking of? He cried. You don't mean to say you were thinking of going back? Indeed I am, unfortunately. I must get up to London tonight. Why, bless my heart, cried the squire, getting up and standing a bit. You've not been here a week. It is all the leave I could get, Mr. Todhitley. A week. I thought you understood that. You can't go away till you are cured, roared the squire. Why didn't you go back the day you came? Don't talk nonsense, Marks. Indeed, I should like to stay longer, he earnestly said. I wish I could. Don't you see, Mr. Todhitley, that it does not lie with me? Do you dare to look me in the face, Marks, and tell me this 1 week's rest has cured you? What on earth? Are you turning silly? It has done me a great deal of good. It has not, Marks. It can't have done it. Not real good, came the squire's interruption. One would think you were a child. It was with difficulty I obtained this 1 week's leave, he explained. I am really required in the office. My absence I know causes trouble. This holiday has done so much for me that I shall go back with a good heart. Look here, said the squire. Suppose you take French leave and stay? In that case my discharge would doubtless arrive by the first post. Look here again. Suppose in a month or 2 you break down and have to leave. What then? Brown and Company would appoint a fresh clerk in my place. Why don't Brown and Company keep another clerk or 2, so as to work you all less? Mark smiled at the very idea. That would increase their expenses, Mr. Todhitley. They will never do that. It is a part of the business of Brown's life to keep expenses down. Well, Marks had to go. The squire was very serious in thinking more rest absolutely needful. Of what service could a week be, he reiterated. Down he sat, wrote a letter to Brown and Company, telling them his opinion, and requesting the favor of their dispatching James Marks back for a longer holiday. This he sent by post, and they would get it in the morning. No, I'll not trust it to you, Marks, he said. You might never deliver it. Catch an old bird with chaff. To this letter there came no answer at all, and Mr. Marks did not come back. The squire relieved his mind by calling Brown and Company thieves and wretches, and so it passed. It must be remembered that I am writing of past years, when holidays were not so universal for any class, clerk or master, as they are at present. Not that I am aware whether financiers' clerks get them now. The next scene in the drama I can only tell by hearsay. It took place in London, where I was not. It was a dull, rainy day in February, and Mrs. Marks sat in her parlor in Pimlico. The house was one of a long row, and the parlor just about large enough to turn in. She sat by the fire, nursing a little 2-year-old girl, and thinking, and 3 other children, the eldest a boy of 9, were playing at the table. building houses on the red cloth with little wooden bricks. Mrs. Marks was a sensible woman, understanding proper management, and had taken care to bring up her children not to be troublesome. She looked about 30 and must have been pretty once, but her face was faded now. Her gray eyes had a sad look in them. The chatter at the table and the bricks fell unheeded on her ear. "Mama, will it soon be tea time?" There was no answer. "Didn't you hear, Mama?" Carrie asked if it would soon be tea time. "What were you thinking about?" She heard this time and started out of her reverie. "Very soon now, Willie dear." "Thinking? Oh, I was thinking about your papa." Her thoughts were by no means bright ones. That her husband's health and powers were failing, she felt as sure of as though she could foresee the ending that was soon to come. How he went on and did his work was a marvel, but he could not give it up or bread would fail. The week's rest in the country had set Mr. Marks up for some months. Until the next autumn, he worked on better than he had been able to do for some time past. And then he failed again. There was no particular failing outwardly, but he felt all too conscious that his overtaxed brain was getting worse than it had ever been. He struggled on, making no sign. That he should have to resign part of his work was an inevitable fact. He must give up the evening bookkeeping to enable him to keep his more important place. "Once let me get Christmas work over," thought he, "and as soon as possible in the new year, I will resign." He got the Christmas work over. Very heavy it was at both places and nearly did for him. It is the last straw, that breaks the camel's back. And that work broke James Marks. Towards the end of January, he was laid up in bed with a violent cold that settled on his chest. Brown and Company had to do without him for 11 days, a calamity that, so far as Marks was concerned, had never happened in Brown and Company's experience. Then he went back to the city again, feeling shaken. But the evening labor was perforce given up. No one knew how ill he was, or, to speak more correctly, how unfit for work, how more incapable of it he was growing day by day. His wife suspected a little. She knew of his sleepless nights, the result of overtaxed nerves and brain, when he would toss and turn and get up and walk the room, and dress himself in the morning without having slept. "There are times," he said to her in a sort of horror, "when I cannot at all collect my thoughts. I am as long again at my work as I used to be, and have to go over it again and again. There have been one or two mistakes, and old Brown asks what is coming to me. I can't help it. The figures whirl before me, and I lose my power of mind." "If you could only sleep well," said Mrs. Marks. "If I could. The brain is as much at work by night as by day. There are the figures mentally before me, and there am I, adding them up. You should see a clever physician, James. Spare the guinea and go. It may be more than the guinea saved." Mr. Marks took the advice. He went to a clever doctor, explained his position, the kind of work he had to do, and described his symptoms. "Can I be cured?" he asked. "Oh yes, I think so," said the doctor, cheerfully, without telling him that he had gone on so far as to make it rather doubtful. "The necessary treatment is very simple. Take change of scene and perfect rest." "For how long?" 12 months at least." 12 months, repeated Marks in a queer tone. "At least. It is a case of absolute necessity. I will write you a prescription for a tonic. You must live well. You have not lived well enough for the work you have to do." As James Marks went out into the street, he could have laughed a laugh of bitter mockery. 12 months rest for him? The doctor had told him one thing, that had he taken rest in time, a very, very much shorter period would have sufficed. "I wonder how many poor men there are like myself in London at this moment," he thought, "who want this rest and cannot take it, and who ought to live better and cannot afford to do it." It was altogether so very hopeless that he did nothing except take the tonic, and he continued to go to the city as usual. Some 2 or 3 weeks had elapsed since then. He, of course, growing worse, though there was nothing to show it outwardly. And this was the end of February, and Mrs. Marks sat thinking of it all over the fire, thinking of what she knew, and guessing at what she did not know, and her children were building houses at the table. The servant came in with the tea things and took the little girl. Only one servant could be kept, and hardly that. Mrs. Marks had made her own tea and was pouring out the children's milk and water, when they heard a cab drive up and stop at the door. A minute after Mr. Marks entered, leaning on the arm of one of his fellow clerks. "Here, Mrs. Marks, I have brought you an invalid," said the latter gaily, making light of it for her sake. "He seems better now. I don't think there's much the matter with him." Had it come? Had what she had been dreading come? That he was going to have an illness, she wondered. But she was a trump of a wife, and showed herself calm and comforting. "You shall both of you have some tea at once," she said cheerfully. "Willie, run and get more teacups." It appeared that Mr. Marks had been, as the clerk expressed it, very queer that day, more so than usual. He could not do his work at all, had to get assistance continually from one or the other, and ended by falling off his stool to the floor in what he called afterwards a sensation of giddiness. He seemed fit for nothing, and Mr. Brown said he had better be taken home. That day ended James Marks's work. He had broken down. At night, he told his wife what the physician had said, which he had not done before. She could scarcely conceal her dismay. A 12 months' rest for him, what would become of them? Failing his salary, they would have no means whatever of living. "Oh, if my father had only acted by us as he ought," she mentally cried. James could have taken rest in time then, and all would have been well. Will he help us now it has come to this? Will she let him? For it is she who holds him in subjection and steels his heart against us. Mr. Stockley, the father, lived at Sydenham. She, the new wife, had taken him off there from his residence in Pimlico as soon as might be after the marriage, and the daughter had never been invited inside the house. But she resolved to go there now. Saying nothing to her husband, Mrs. Marks started for Sydenham the day after he was brought home ill, and found the place without trouble. The wife, formerly the cook, was a big brawny woman with a cheek and a tongue of her own. When Mrs. Marks was shown in, she forgot herself in the surprise. Old habits prevailed, and she half dropped a curtsy. "I wish to see Papa, Mrs. Stockley." "Mr. Stockley's out, ma'am." "Then I must wait until he returns." Mrs. Stockley did not see her way clear to turn this lady from the house, though she would have liked to do it. She made a show of hospitality and ordered wine and cake to be put on the table, of which wine Mrs. Marks noticed with surprise. She drank 4 glasses. Now and then we used to suspect her of drinking in the kitchen, ran through Mrs. Marks's thoughts. Has it grown upon her? The garden gate opened, and Mr. Stockley came through it. He was so bowed and broken that his daughter scarcely knew him. She hastened out and met him in the path. "Caroline," he exclaimed in amazement. "Is it really you? How much you have changed!" "I came down to speak to you, Papa. May we stay and talk here in the garden?" He seemed glad to see her, rather than not, and sat down with her on the garden bench in the sun. In a quiet voice she told him all, and asked him to help her. Mrs. Stockley had come out and stood listening to the treason, somewhat unsteady in her walk. I would help you if I could, Caroline," he said in hesitation, glancing at his wife. "Yes, but you can't, Stockley," she put in. "Our own expenses is as much as ever we can manage, Mrs. Marks. It's a orful cost, living out here, and our 2 servants is the very deuce for extravagance. I've changed 'em both 10 times for others, and the last lot is always worse than the first. Papa, do you see our position?" resumed Mrs. Marks after hearing the lady patiently. "It will be a long time before James is able to do anything again, if he ever is, and we have not been able to save money. What are we to do? Go to the workhouse? I have 4 little children. You know that you can't help, Stockley," insisted Mr. Stockley's lady, taking up the answer, her face growing more inflamed. "You've not got the means to do anything, and there's an end on't." "It is true, Caroline. I'm afraid I have not," he said, and his daughter saw with pain how tremblingly subject he was to his wife. "I seem short of money always. How did you come down, my dear?" "By the train, Papa. 3rd class." "Oh, dear," cried Mr. Stockley. "My health's broken, Caroline. It is indeed, and my spirit too. I'm sure I am very sorry for you. Will you come in and take some dinner?" "We've got nothing but a bit of ashed beef," cried Mrs. Stockley, as if to put a damper upon the invitation. "Him and me fails and our appetites dreadful. I can't think what's come to him." Mrs. Marks declined dinner. She had to get back to the children. That any sort of pleading would be useless while that woman held sway, she saw well. "Goodbye, Papa," she said. "I suppose we must do the best we can alone. Good morning, Mrs. Stockley. To her surprise, her father kissed her with quivering lips. "I will open the gate for you, my dear," he said, hastening on to it. As she was going through, he slipped a sovereign into her hand. "It will pay for your journey, at least, my dear. I am sorry to hear of your traveling third class. Ah, times have changed. It is not that I won't help you, child, but that I can't." She goes up to receive the dividends and keeps me short. I should not have had that sovereign now, but it is the change out of the spirit bill that she sent me to pay. Hush! The money goes in drink. She drinks like a fish. "Ah, Caroline, I was a fool. Fare you well, my dear. Fare you well, dear papa, and thank you," she answered, turning away with brimming eyes and an aching heart. After resting for some days and getting no better, James Marks had to give it up as a bad job. He went to the city house, saw Mr. Brown, and told him. "Broken down," cried old Brown, hitching back his wig, as he always did when put out. "I never heard such nonsense. At your age, the thing's incomprehensible. The work has been very wearing to the brain, sir, and my application to it was close. During the 23 years I have been with you, I have never had but 1 week's holiday. The one last spring. You told me then you felt like a man breaking down, as if you were good for nothing," resentfully spoke old Brown. "Yes, sir. I told you that I believed I was breaking down for want of a rest," replied Marks. "It has proved so." "Why? You had your rest." 1 week, sir. I said I feared it would not be of much use. But it was not convenient for you to allow me more." "Of course it was not convenient. You know it could not be convenient," retorted old Brown. "Do you think I keep my clerks for play, Marks? Do you suppose my business will get done of itself? I was aware myself, sir, how inconvenient my absence would be, and therefore I did not press the matter. That 1 week's rest did me a wonderful amount of service. It enabled me to go on until now." Old Brown looked at him. "See here, Marks, we are sorry to lose you. Suppose you take another week's change now, and try what it will do. A fortnight, say. Go to the seaside, or somewhere." Marks shook his head. "Too late, sir. The doctors tell me it will be 12 months before I am able to work again at calculations." "Oh, my service to you," cried Mr. Brown. "Why, what are you going to do if you cannot work?" "That is a great deal more than I can say, sir. The thought of it is troubling my brain quite as much as work ever did. It is never out of it, night or day." For once in his screwy life, old Brown was generous. He told Mr. Marks to draw his salary up to the day he had left, and he added £10 to it over and above. During that visit I paid to Miss Devine's in London, when Todd was with the Whitneys, and Helen made her first curtsy to the Queen, and we discovered the ill doings of that siren, Mademoiselle Sophie Chalk. I saw Marks. Mrs. Todditley had given me 2 or 3 commissions, as may be remembered. One amongst them was to call in Pimlico and see how Marks was getting on. Accordingly I went. We had heard nothing, you must understand, of what I have told above, and did not know, but he was still in his situation. It was a showery day in April, just a 12-month, by the way, since his visit to us at Dyke Manor. I found the house out readily. It was near Ebury Street, and I knocked. A young lad opened the door and asked me to walk into the parlor. "You are Mr. Marks's son?" I said, rubbing my feet on the mat. "I can tell by the likeness." "What's your name?" "William." "Papa's is James." "Yes, I know." "He is ill," whispered the lad, with his hand on the door handle. "Mamma's downstairs, making him some arrowroot. Well, I think you might have knocked me down with a feather when I knew him, for at first I did not." He was sitting in an easy chair by the fire, dressed but wrapped round with blankets. And instead of being the James Marks we had known, he was like a living skeleton, with cheekbones and hollow eyes. But he was glad to see me, smiled, and held out his hand from the blanket. It is uncommonly awkward for a young fellow to be taken unawares like this. You don't know what to say. I'm sure I as much thought he was dying as I ever thought anything in this world. At last I managed to stammer a word or two about being sorry to see him so ill. "I," said he in a weak, panting voice, "I am different from what I was when with your kind people, Johnny. The trouble I foresaw then has come. You used sometimes to feel then as though you would not long keep up," was my answer, for really I could find nothing else to say. He nodded. "Yes, I felt that I was breaking down, that I should inevitably break down unless I could have rest. I went on until February, Johnny, and then it came. I had to give up my situation. And since then, I have been dangerously ill from another source. Chest and lungs. I did not know your lungs were weak, Mr. Marks. I'm sure I did not, he said after a fit of coughing. I had one attack in January through catching a cold. Then I caught another cold, and you see the result. The doctor hardly saved me. I never was subject to take cold before. I suppose the fact is that when a man breaks down in one way, he gets weak in all and is more liable to other ailments. I hope you will get better as the warm weather comes on. We shall soon have it here. Better of this cough, perhaps. I don't know, but not better yet of my true illness that I think most of, the overtaxed nerves and brain. Oh, if I could only have taken a sufficient rest in time. Mr. Todd at least said you ought to have stayed with us for 3 months. He says it often still. I believe, he said, solemnly lifting his hand, that if I could have had entire rest then for 2 or 3 months, it would have set me up for life. Heaven hears me say it, and what a dreadful thing it now seemed that he had not. I don't repine. My lot seems a hard one, and I sometimes feel sick and weary when I dwell upon it. I have tried to do my duty. I could but keep on and work, as God knows. There was no other course open to me. I suppose there was not. I am no worse off than many others, Johnny. There are men breaking down every day from incessant application and want of needful rest. Well for them if their hearts don't break with it. And, to judge by the tone he spoke in, it was as much as to say that his heart had broken. I am beginning to dwell less on it now, he went on. Perhaps it is that I am too weak to feel so keenly, or that Christ's words are being indeed realized to me. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. God does not forsake us in our trouble, Johnny, once we have learned to turn to him. Mrs. Marks came into the room with a cup of arrowroot. The boy had run down to tell her I was there. She was very pleasant and cheerful. You could be at home with her at once. While he was waiting for the arrowroot to cool, he leant back in his chair and dropped into a doze. It must have been a frightful cold that he caught, I whispered to her. It was caught the day he went into the city to tell Mr. Brown he must give up his situation, she answered. There's an old saying of being penny wise and pound foolish, and that's what poor James was that day. It was a fine morning when he started, but rain set in, and when he left Mr. Brown it was pouring, and the streets were wet. He ought to have taken a cab, but did not, and waited for an omnibus. The first that passed was full. By the time another came, he had got wet, and his feet were soaking. That brought on a return of the illness he had had in January. I hope you will get well. It lies with God, she answered. They made me promise to go again. Soon, Johnny, soon, said Mr. Marks with an eagerness that was suggestive. Come in the afternoon and have some tea with me. I had meant to obey literally and go in a day or two, but one thing or other kept intervening, and a week or 10 days passed. One Wednesday Miss Devine was engaged to a dinner party, and I took the opportunity to go to Pimlico. It was a stormy afternoon, blowing great guns 1 minute, pouring cats and dogs the next. Mrs. Marks was alone in the parlor, the tea things on the table before her. We thought you had forgotten us, she said in a half-whisper, shaking hands. But this is the best time you could have come, for a kind neighbor has invited all the children in for the evening, and we shall be quiet. James is worse. Worse. At least weaker. He cannot sit up long now without great fatigue. He lay down on the bed an hour ago and has dropped asleep, she added, indicating the next room. I am waiting for him to awake before I make the tea. He awoke then. The cough betrayed it. She went into the room, and presently he came back with her. No doubt he was worse. My heart sank at seeing him. If he had looked like a skeleton before, he was like a skeleton's ghost now. Ah, Johnny, I knew you would come. I told him how it was I had not been able to come before, going into details. It seemed to amuse him to hear of the engagements, and I described Helen Whitney's court dress as well as I could, and Lady Whitney's, and the servants' great bouquets, and the ball at night. He ate 1 bit of thin toast and drank 3 big cups of tea. Mrs. Marks said he was always thirsty. After tea, he had a violent fit of coughing and thought he must lie down to rest for a bit. Mrs. Marks came back and sat with me. I hope you will get well, I could not help saying to her. She shook her head. I fear he has not much hope of it himself, she answered. Only yesterday I heard him tell Willie that God would take care of them when he was gone. She could hardly speak the last words and broke down with a sob. I wished I had not said anything. He has great trust, but things trouble him very much, she resumed. Nothing else can be expected, for he knows that our means are almost spent. It must trouble you also, Mrs. Marks. I seem to have so much to trouble me that I dare not dwell upon it. I pray not to, every hour of the day. If I gave way, what would become of them? At dark she lighted the candles and drew down the blinds. Just after that, there came a tremendous knock at the front door, loud and long. "Naughty children," she exclaimed. "It must be they. I'll go. Don't you stir, Mrs. Marks." I opened the door, and a rush of wind and rain seemed to blow in an old gentleman. He never said a word to me, but went banging into the parlor and sank down on a chair out of breath. "Papa!" exclaimed Mrs. Marks. "Papa!" "Wait till I get up my speech, my dear," said the old gentleman. "She is gone." "Who is gone?" cried Mrs. Marks. "She. I don't want to say too much against her now she's gone, Caroline, but she is gone. She had a bad fall downstairs in a tipsy fit some days ago, striking her head on the flags, and the doctors could do nothing for her. She died this morning, poor soul, and I am coming to live with you and James, if you will have me. We shall all be so comfortable together, my dear." Perhaps Mrs. Marks remembered at once what it implied, that the pressure of poverty was suddenly lifted and she and those dear ones would be at ease for the future. She bent her head in her hands for a minute or two, keeping silence. "Your husband shall have rest now, my dear, and all that he needs. So will you, Caroline?" It had come too late. James Marks died in May. It was about 3 or 4 years afterwards that we saw the death of Mr. Brown in the Times. The newspapers made a flourish of trumpets over him, saying he had died worth £200,000. "There must be something wrong somewhere, Johnny," remarked the squire in a puzzle. "I should not like to die worth all that money and know that I had worked my clerks to the bone to get it together. I wonder how he will like meeting poor Marks in the next world." Chapter 18. Reality or Delusion. This is a ghost story. Every word of it is true, and I don't mind confessing that for ages afterwards some of us did not care to pass the spot alone at night. Some people do not care to pass it yet. It was autumn, and we were at Crab Cot. Lena had been ailing, and in October Mrs. Todd Hitley proposed to the squire that they should remove with her there, to see if the change would do her good. We Worcestershire people call North Crab a village, but one might count the houses in it, little and great, and not find 24. South Crab, half a mile off, is ever so much larger. But the church and school are at North Crab. John Ferrer had been employed by Squire Todd Hitley as a sort of overlooker on the estate, or working bailiff. He had died the previous winter, leaving nothing behind him except some debts, for he was not provident, and his handsome son Daniel. Daniel Ferrer, who was rather superior as far as education went, disliked work. He would make a show of helping his father, but it came to little. Old Ferrer had not put him to any particular trade or occupation, and Daniel, who was as proud as Lucifer, would not turn to it himself. He liked to be a gentleman. All he did now was to work in his garden and feed his fowls, ducks, rabbits, and pigeons, of which he kept a great quantity, selling them to the houses around and sending them to market. But, as everyone said, poultry would not maintain him. Mrs. Leese, in the pretty cottage hard by Ferrers, grew tired of saying it. This Mrs. Leese and her daughter, Maria, must not be confounded with Leese the pointsman. They were in a better condition of life, and not related to him. Daniel Ferrer used to run in and out of their house at will when a boy, and he was now engaged to be married to Maria. She would have a little money, and the Leases were respected in North Crab. People began to whisper a query as to how Ferrer got his corn for the poultry. He was not known to buy much, and he would have to go out of his house at Christmas, for its owner, Mr. Coney, had given him notice. Mrs. Leese, anxious about Maria's prospects, asked Daniel what he intended to do then, and he answered, make his fortune. He should begin to do it as soon as he could turn himself round. But the time was going on, and the turning round seemed to be as far off as ever. After midsummer, a niece of the schoolmistress's, Miss Timmins, had come to the school to stay. Her name was Harriet Rowe. The father, Humphrey Rowe, was half-brother to Miss Timmins. He had married a Frenchwoman and lived more in France than in England until his death. The girl had been christened Henriette, but North Crabbe, not understanding much French, converted it into Harriet. She was a showy, free-mannered, good-looking girl and made speedy acquaintance with Daniel Farrer, or he with her. They improved upon it so rapidly that Maria Lease grew jealous, and North Crabbe began to say he cared for Harriet more than for Maria. When Todd and I got home the latter end of October to spend the squire's birthday, things were in this state. James Hill, the bailiff who had been taken on by the squire in John Farrer's place, but a far inferior man to Farrer, not much better, in fact, than a common workman, and of whose doings you will hear soon in regard to his little stepson, David Garth, gave us an account of matters in general. Daniel Farrer had been drinking lately, Hill added, and his head was not strong enough to stand it, and he was also beginning to look as if he had some care upon him. A nice lot, for them two women to be fighting for, cried Hill, who was no friend to Farrer. There'll be mischief between 'em if they don't draw in a bit. Maria Lease is next door to mad over it, I know, and t'other, finding herself the best liked, crows over her. It's something like the Bible story of Leah and Rachel. Young gents, Dan Farrer likes the one, and he's bound by promise to the t'other. As to the French jade, concluded Hill, giving his head a toss, she'd make a show of liking any man that followed her. She would, a dozen of them on a string. It was all very well for Surly Hill to call Daniel Farrer a nice lot, but he was the best-looking fellow in church on Sunday morning, well-dressed too. But his colors seemed brighter, and his hands shook as they were raised, often, to push back his hair, that the sun shone upon through the south window, turning it to gold. He scarcely looked up, not even at Harriet Rowe, with her dark eyes roving everywhere, and her streaming pink ribbons. Maria Lease was pale, quiet, and nice, as usual. She had no beauty, but her face was sensible, and her deep gray eyes had a strange and curious earnestness. The new parson preached, a young man just appointed to the parish of Crabbe. He went in for great observances of saints' days, and told his congregation that he should expect to see them at church on the morrow, which would be the feast of all saints. Daniel Farrer walked home with Mrs. Lease and Maria after service, and was invited to dinner. I ran across to shake hands with the old dame, who had once nursed me through an illness, and promised to look in and see her later. We were going back to school on the morrow. As I turned away, Harriet Rowe passed, her pink ribbons and her cheap gay silk dress gleaming in the sunlight. She stared at me, and I stared back again. And now, the explanation of matters being over, the real story begins. But I shall have to tell some of it as it was told by others. The tea things waited on Mrs. Lease's table in the afternoon, waited for Daniel Farrer. He had left them shortly before to go and attend to his poultry. Nothing had been said about his coming back for tea. That he would do so had been looked upon as a matter of course. But he did not make his appearance, and the tea was taken without him. At 5:30 the church bell rang out for evening service, and Maria put her things on. Mrs. Lease did not go out at night. "You are starting early, Maria. You'll be in church before other people." "That won't matter, Mother." A jealous suspicion lay on Maria that the secret of Daniel Farrer's absence was his having fallen in with Harriet Rowe. Perhaps had gone of his own accord to seek her. She walked slowly along. The gloom of dusk, and a deep dusk, had stolen over the evening, but the moon would be up later. As Maria passed the schoolhouse, she halted to glance in at the little sitting-room window. The shutters were not closed yet, and the room was lighted by the blazing fire. Harriet was not there. She only saw Miss Timmins, the mistress, who was putting on her bonnet before a hand-glass propped upright on the mantelpiece. Without warning, Miss Timmins turned and threw open the window. It was only for the purpose of pulling to the shutters, but Maria thought she must have been observed and spoke. "Good evening, Miss Timmins." "Who is it?" cried out Miss Timmins in answer, peering into the dusk. "Oh, it's you, Maria Lease. Have you seen anything of Harriet? She went off somewhere this afternoon, and never came in to tea. I have not seen her. She's gone to the Batleys, I'll be bound. She knows I don't like her to be with the Batley girls. They make her 10 times flightier than she would otherwise be." Miss Timmins drew in her shutters with a jerk, without which they would not close, and Maria Lease turned away. "Not at the Batleys, not at the Batleys, but with him," she cried in bitter rebellion as she turned away from the church. From the church, not to it. Was Maria to blame for wishing to see whether she was right or not? For walking about a little in the thought of meeting them? At any rate, it is what she did, and had her reward, such as it was. As she was passing the top of the Withy Walk, their voices reached her ear. People often walked there, and it was one of the ways to South Crab. Maria drew back amidst the trees, and they came on, Harriet Rowe and Daniel Farrer, walking arm in arm. "I think I had better take it off," Harriet was saying. "No need to invoke a storm upon my head." And that would come in a shower of hail from stiff old Aunt Timmins. The answer seemed one of quick accent, but Farrer spoke low. Maria Lease had hard work to control herself. Anger, passion, jealousy, all blazed up. With her arms stretched out to a friendly tree on either side, with her heart beating, with her pulses coursing onto fever heat, she watched them across the bit of common to the road. Harriet went one way then, he another in the direction of Mrs. Lease's cottage. No doubt to fetch her, Maria, to church, with a plausible excuse of having been detained. Until now she had had no proof of his falseness, had never perfectly believed in it. She took her arms from the trees and went forward, a sharp, faint cry of despair breaking forth on the night air. Maria Lease was one of those silent-natured girls who can never speak of a wrong like this. She had to bury it within her. Down, down, out of sight and show, and she went into church with her usual quiet step. Harriet Rowe with Miss Timmins came next, quite demure, as if she had been singing some of the infant scholars to sleep at their own homes. Daniel Farrer did not go to church at all. He stayed, as was found afterwards, with Mrs. Lease. Maria might as well have been at home as at church. Better perhaps that she had been. Not a syllable of the service did she hear. Her brain was a sea of confusion, the tumult within it rising higher and higher. She did not hear even the text, "Peace, be still," or the sermon, both so singularly appropriate. The passions in men's minds, the preacher said, raged and foamed just like the angry waves of the sea in a storm, until Jesus came to still them. I ran after Maria when church was over, and went in to pay the promised visit to old Mother Lease. Daniel Farrer was sitting in the parlor. He got up and offered Maria a chair at the fire, but she turned her back and stood at the table under the window, taking off her gloves. An open Bible was before Mrs. Lease. I wondered whether she had been reading aloud to Daniel. "What was the text, child?" asked the old lady. No answer. "Do you hear, Maria? What was the text?" Maria turned at that, as if suddenly awakened. Her face was white. Her eyes had in them an uncertain terror. "The text," she stammered. I forget it, Mother. It was from Genesis, I think. Was it, Master Johnny?" "It was from the 4th chapter of St. Mark. Peace, be still." Mrs. Lease stared at me. "Why, that is the very chapter I've been reading." "Well now, that's curious. But there's never a better in the Bible, and never a better text was taken from it than those 3 words. I have been telling Daniel here, Master Johnny, that when once that peace, Christ's peace, is got into the heart, storms can't hurt us much. And you are going away again tomorrow, sir?" she added after a pause. "It's a short stay?" "I was not going away on the morrow. Todd and I, taking the squire in a genial moment after dinner, had pressed to be let stay until Tuesday, Todd using the argument, and laughing while he did it, that it must be wrong to travel on All Saints' Day, when the parson had specially enjoined us to be at church. The squire told us we were a couple of encroaching rascals, and if he did let us stay, it should be upon condition that we did go to church. This I said to them. "He may send you all the same, sir, when the morning comes," remarked Daniel Farrer. "Knowing Mr. Todditley as you do Farrer, you may remember that he never breaks his promises." Daniel laughed. "He grumbles over them, though, Master Johnny." "Well, he may grumble tomorrow about our staying, say it is wasting time that ought to be spent in study, but he will not send us back until Tuesday." "Until Tuesday? If I could have foreseen, then what would have happened before Tuesday? If all of us could have seen the few hours between now and then depicted, as in a mirror, event by event, would it have saved the calamity, the dreadful sin that could never be redeemed? Why, yes, surely it would." Daniel Farrer turned and looked at Maria. "Why don't you come to the fire?" I am very well here. Thank you. She had sat down where she was, her bonnet touching the curtain. Mrs. Leese, not noticing that anything was wrong, had begun talking about Lena, whose illness was turning to low fever, when the house door opened and Harriet Rowe came in. "What a lovely night it is," she said, taking of her own accord the chair I had not cared to take, for I kept saying I must go. "Maria, what went with you after church? I hunted for you everywhere." Maria gave no answer. She looked black and angry, and her bosom heaved as if a storm were brewing. Harriet Rowe slightly laughed. "Do you intend to take holiday tomorrow, Mrs. Leese?" "Me take holiday? What is there in tomorrow to take holiday for?" returned Mrs. Leese. "I shall," continued Harriet, not answering the question. "I have been used to it in France. All Saints' Day is a grand holiday there. We go to church in our best clothes and pay visits afterwards. Following it, like a dark shadow, comes the gloomy jour de morts." "The what?" cried Mrs. Leese, bending her ear. "The Day of the Dead. All Souls' Day. But you English don't go to the cemeteries to pray." Mrs. Leese put on her spectacles, which lay upon the open pages of the Bible, and stared at Harriet. Perhaps she thought they might help her to understand. The girl laughed. "On All Souls' Day, whether it be wet or dry, the French cemeteries are full of kneeling women draped in black, all praying for the repose of their dead relatives, after the manner of the Roman Catholics." Daniel Farrer, who had not spoken a word since she came in, but sat with his face to the fire, turned and looked at her, upon which she tossed back her head and her pink ribbons and smiled till all her teeth were seen. Good teeth they were. As to reverence in her tone, there was none. "I have seen them kneeling when the slosh and wet have been ankle-deep. Did you ever see a ghost?" added she with energy. "The French believe that the spirits of the dead come abroad on the night of All Saints' Day. You'd scarcely get a French woman to go out of her house after dark. It is their chief superstition." "What is the superstition?" questioned Mrs. Leese. "Why that," said Harriet. "They believe that the dead are allowed to revisit the world after dark on the eve of All Souls, that they hover in the air, waiting to appear to any of their living relatives who may venture out, lest they should forget to pray on the morrow for the rest of their souls." "Well, I never," cried Mrs. Leese, staring excessively. "Did you ever hear the like of that, sir?" turning to me. "Yes, I have heard of it." Harriet Rowe looked up at me. I was standing at the corner of the mantelpiece. She laughed a free laugh. "I say, wouldn't it be fun to go out tomorrow night and meet the ghosts? Only, perhaps they don't visit this country, as it is not under Rome." "Now just you behave yourself before your betters, Harriet Rowe," put in Mrs. Leese sharply. "That gentleman is young Mr. Ludlow of Crabcott, and very happy I am to make young Mr. Ludlow's acquaintance," returned easy Harriet, flinging back her mantle from her shoulders. "How hot your parlor is, Mrs. Leese." The hook of the cloak had caught in a thin chain of twisted gold that she wore round her neck, displaying it to view. She hurriedly folded her cloak together, as if wishing to conceal the chain. But Mrs. Leese's spectacles had seen it. "What's that you've got on, Harriet? A gold chain?" A moment's pause, and then Harriet Rowe flung back her mantle again, defiance upon her face, and touched the chain with her hand. "That's what it is, Mrs. Leese, a gold chain. And a very pretty one, too. Was it your mother's?" "It was never anybody's but mine. I had it made a present to me this afternoon, for a keepsake." Happening to look at Maria, I was startled at her face. It was so white and dark. White with emotion, dark with an angry despair that I for one did not comprehend. Harriet Rowe, throwing at her a look of saucy triumph, went out with as little ceremony as she had come in, just calling back a general good night, and we heard her footsteps outside, getting gradually fainter in the distance. Daniel Farrer rose. "I'll take my departure too, I think. You are very unsociable tonight, Maria." "Perhaps I am. Perhaps I have cause to be." She flung his hand back when he held it out, and in another moment, as if a thought struck her, ran after him into the passage to speak. I, standing near the door in the small room, caught the words, "I must have an explanation with you, Daniel Farrer. Now, tonight. We cannot go on thus for a single hour longer. Not tonight, Maria. I have no time to spare. And I don't know what you mean." "You do know. Listen, I will not go to my rest, no, though it were for 20 nights to come, until we have had it out. I vow I will not. There! You are playing with me. Others have long said so, and I know it now. He seemed to speak some quieting words to her, for the tone was low and soothing, and then went out, closing the door behind him. Maria came back and stood with her face and its ghastliness turned from us. And still the old mother noticed nothing. "Why don't you take your things off, Maria?" she asked. "Presently," was the answer. I said good night in my turn and went away. Halfway home I met Todd with the two young Lexhams. The Lexhams made us go in and stay to supper, and it was 10 o'clock before we left them. "We shall catch it," said Todd, setting off at a run. They never let us stay out late on a Sunday evening on account of the reading. But, as it happened, we escaped scot-free this time, for the house was in a commotion about Lena. She had been better in the afternoon, but at 9 o'clock the fever returned worse than ever. Her little cheeks and lips were scarlet as she lay on the bed. Her wide-open eyes were bright and glistening. The squire had gone up to look at her, and was fuming and fretting in his usual fashion. "The doctor has never sent the medicine," said patient Mrs. Todditley, who must have been worn out with nursing. "She ought to take it. I am sure she ought. These boys are good to run over to Cole's for that," cried the squire. "It won't hurt them. It's a fine night." Of course we were good for it, and we got our caps again, being charged to enjoin Mr. Cole to come over the first thing in the morning. "Do you care much about my going with you, Johnny?" Todd asked as we were turning out at the door. "I'm awfully tired." "Not a bit. I'd as soon go alone as not. You'll see me back in half an hour." I took the nearest way, flying across the fields at a canter and startling the hares. Mr. Cole lived near South Crab, and I don't believe more than 10 minutes had gone by when I knocked at his door. But to get back as quickly was another thing. The doctor was not at home. He had been called out to a patient at 8 o'clock and had not yet returned. I went in to wait. The servant said he might be expected to come in from minute to minute. It was of no use to go away without the medicine, and I sat down in the surgery in front of the shelves and fell asleep counting the white jars and physic bottles. The doctor's entrance awoke me. "I am sorry you should have had to come over and to wait," he said. When my other patient, with whom I was detained a considerable time, was done with, I went on to Crab Cot with the child's medicine, which I had in my pocket. "They think her very ill tonight, sir." I left her better and going quietly to sleep. "She will soon be well again, I hope." "Why, is that the time?" I exclaimed, happening to catch sight of the clock as I was crossing the hall. It was nearly 12. Mr. Cole laughed, saying time passed quickly when folk were asleep. I went back slowly. The sleep, or the canter before it, had made me feel as tired as Todd had said he was. It was a night to be abroad in and to enjoy. Calm, warm light. The moon, high in the sky, illumined every blade of grass, sparkled on the water of the little rivulet, brought out the moss on the gray walls of the old church, played on its round-faced clock, then striking 12. 12 o'clock at night at North Crab answers to about 3 in the morning in London, for country people are mostly in bed and asleep at 10. Therefore, when loud and angry voices struck up in dispute, just as the last stroke of the hour was dying away on the midnight air, I stood still and doubted my ears. I was getting near home then. The sounds came from the back of a building standing alone in a solitary place on the left-hand side of the road. It belonged to the squire, and was called the Yellow Barn, its walls being covered with a yellow wash. But it was in fact used as a storehouse for corn. I was passing in front of it when the voices rose upon the air. Round the building I ran and saw Maria Lease, and something else that I could not at first comprehend. In the pursuit of her vow, not to go to rest until she had had it out with Daniel Farrer, Maria had been abroad searching for him. What ill fate brought her looking for him up near our barn? Perhaps because she had fruitlessly searched in every other spot. At the back of this barn, up some steps, was an unused door. Unused partly because it was not required, the principal entrance being in front, partly because the key of it had been for a long time missing. Stealing out at this door, a bag of corn upon his shoulders, had come Daniel Farrer in a smock frock. Maria saw him and stood back in the shade. She watched him lock the door and put the key in his pocket. She watched him give the heavy bag a jerk as he turned to come down the steps. Then she burst out. Her loud reproaches petrified him, and he stood there as one suddenly turned to stone. It was at that moment that I appeared. I understood it all soon. It needed not Maria's words to enlighten me. Daniel Ferrer possessed the lost key and could come in and out at will in the midnight hours when the world was sleeping and help himself to the corn. No wonder his poultry throve. No wonder there had been grumblings at Crabcott at the mysterious disappearance of the good grain. Maria Leese was decidedly mad in those few first moments. Stealing is looked upon in an honest village as an awful thing, a disgrace, a crime, and there was the night's earlier misery besides. Daniel Ferrer was a thief. Daniel Ferrer was false to her. A storm of words and reproaches poured forth from her in confusion, none of it very distinct. Living upon theft, convicted felon, transportation for life, Squire Toddetly's corn, fattening poultry on stolen goods, buying gold chains with the profits for that bold, flaunting French girl, Harriet Rowe, taking his stealthy walks with her. My going up to them stopped the charge. There was a pause, and then Maria, in her mad passion, denounced him to me as representative, so she put it, of the squire, the breaker in upon our premises, the robber of our stored corn. Daniel Ferrer came down the steps. He had remained there still as a statue, immovable, and turned his white face to me. Never a word in defense said he. The blow had crushed him. He was a proud man, if anyone can understand that, and to be discovered in this ill-doing was worse than death to him. "Don't think of me more hardly than you can help, Master Johnny," he said in a quiet tone. "I've been almost tired of my life this long while." Putting down the bag of corn near the steps, he took the key from his pocket and handed it to me. The man's aspect had so changed. There was something so grievously subdued and sad about him altogether that I felt as sorry for him as if he had not been guilty. Maria Leese went on in her fiery passion. "You'll be more tired of it tomorrow when the police are taking you to Worcester jail. Squire Toddetly will not spare you, though your father was his many years' bailiff. He could not, you know, if he wished. Master Ludlow has seen you in the act." "Let me have the key again for a minute, sir," he said, as quietly as though he had not heard a word. And I gave it to him. I'm not sure, but I should have given him my head had he asked for it. He swung the bag on his shoulders, unlocked the granary door, and put the bag beside the other sacks. The bag was his own, as we found afterwards, but he left it there. Locking the door again, he gave me the key and went away with a weary step. "Goodbye, Master Johnny." I answered back good night civilly, though he had been stealing. When he was out of sight, Maria Leese, her passion full upon her still, dashed off towards her mother's cottage, a strange cry of despair breaking from her lips. "Where have you been lingering, Johnny?" roared the squire, who was sitting up for me. "You have been throwing at the owls, sir. That's what you've been at. You have been scudding after the hares." I said I had waited for Mr. Cole, and had come back slower than I went. But I said no more, and went up to my room at once. And the squire went to his. I know I am only a muff. People tell me so, often, but I can't help it. I did not make myself. I lay awake till nearly daylight, first wishing Daniel Ferrer could be screened, and then thinking it might perhaps be done. If he would only take the lesson to heart and go on straight for the future, what a capital thing it would be. We had liked old Ferrer. He had done me and Todd many a good turn, and for the matter of that, we liked Daniel. So I never said a word when morning came of the past night's work. "Is Daniel at home?" I asked, going to Ferrer's the first thing before breakfast. I meant to tell him that if he would keep right, I would keep counsel. "He went out at dawn, sir," answered the old woman who did for him, and sold his poultry at market. "He'll be in presently. He have had no breakfast yet." "Then tell him when he comes to wait in and see me. Tell him it's all right. Can you remember, Goody?" "It is all right. I'll remember, safe enough, Master Ludlow." Todd and I, being on our honor, went to church and found about 10 people in the pews. Harriet Rowe was one, with her pink ribbons, the twisted gold chain showing outside a short-cut velvet jacket. "No, sir. He has not been home yet. I can't think where he can have got to," was the old Goody's reply when I went again to Ferrer's. And so I wrote a word in pencil and told her to give it him when he came in, for I could not go dodging there every hour of the day. After luncheon, strolling by the back of the barn, A certain reminiscence, I suppose, taking me there, for it was not a frequented spot. I saw Maria Elise coming along. Well, it was a change. The passionate woman of the previous night had subsided into a poor, wild-looking, sorrow-stricken thing, ready to die of remorse. Excessive passion had wrought its usual consequences. A reaction in favor of Daniel Ferrer. She came up to me, clasping her hands in agony, beseeching that I would spare him, that I would not tell of him, that I would give him a chance for the future, and her lips quivered and trembled, and there were dark circles round her hollow eyes. I said that I had not told and did not intend to tell, upon which she was going to fall down on her knees, but I rushed off. "Do you know where he is?" I asked when she came to her sober senses. "Oh, I wish I did know. Master Johnny, he is just the man to go and do something desperate. He would never face shame. And I was a mad, hard-hearted, wicked girl to do what I did last night. He might run away to sea. He might go and enlist for a soldier. I dare say he is at home by this time. I've left a word for him there, and promised to go in and see him tonight. If he will undertake not to be up to wrong things again, no one shall ever know of this from me." She went away easier, and I sauntered on towards South Crab. Eager as Todd and I had been for the day's holiday, it did not seem to be turning out much of a boon. In going home again, there was nothing worth staying out for. I had come to the spot by the three-corner grove where I saw Maria, when a galloping policeman overtook me. My heart stood still, for I thought he must have come after Daniel Ferrer. "Can you tell me if I am near to Crabcott, Squire Todd at least?" he asked, reining in his horse. "You will reach it in a minute or two. I live there. Squire Toddetley is not at home. What do you want with him?" "It's only to give in an official paper, sir. I have to leave one personally upon all the county magistrates." He rode on. When I got in, I saw the folded paper upon the hall table. The man and horse had already gone onwards. It was worse indoors than out. Less to be done. Todd had disappeared after church. The squire was abroad. Mrs. Toddetley sat upstairs with Lena, and I strolled out again. It was only 3 o'clock then. An hour, or more, was got through somehow. Meeting one, talking to another, throwing at the ducks and geese, anything. Mrs. Leese had her head, smothered in a yellow shawl, stretched out over the palings as I passed her cottage. "Don't catch cold, mother. I am looking for Maria, sir. I can't think what has come to her today, Master Johnny," she added, dropping her voice to a confidential tone. "The girl seems demented. She has been going in and out ever since daylight like a dog in a fair. If I meet her, I will send her home." And in another minute, I did meet her, for she was coming out of Daniel Ferrer's yard. I supposed he was at home again. "No," she said, looking more wild, worn, haggard than before. "That's what I have been to ask. I am just out of my senses, sir. He is gone for certain." "Gone?" I did not think it. He would not be likely to go away without clothes. "Well, I know he is Master Johnny. Something tells me. I've been all about everywhere. There's a great dread upon me, sir. I never felt anything like it. Wait until night, Maria. I dare say he will go home then. Your mother is looking out for you. I said if I met you, I'd send you in." Mechanically, she turned towards the cottage, and I went on. Presently, as I was sitting on a gate watching the sunset, Harriet rode past towards the Withy Walk and gave me a nod in her free but good-natured way. "Are you going there to look out for the ghost this evening?" I asked, and I wish not long afterwards I had not said it. "It will soon be dark." "So it will," she said, turning to the red sky in the west. "But I have no time to give to the ghost tonight. Have you seen Ferrer today?" I cried, an idea occurring to me. "No, and I can't think where he has got to, unless he is off to Worcester. He told me he should have to go there some day this week." She evidently knew nothing about him, and went on her way with another free and easy nod. I sat on the gate till the sun had gone down, and then thought it was time to be getting homewards. Close against the yellow barn, the scene of last night's trouble, whom should I come upon but Maria Leese? She was standing still, and turned quickly at the sound of my footsteps. Her face was bright again, but had a puzzled look upon it. "I have just seen him. He is not gone," she said in a happy whisper. "You were right, Master Johnny, and I was wrong. Where did you see him?" "Here, not a minute ago. I saw him twice. He is angry, very, and will not let me speak to him. Both times he got away before I could reach him. He is close by somewhere. I looked round, naturally, but Farrer was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing to conceal him except the barn, and that was locked up. The account she gave was this, and her face grew puzzled again as she related it. Unable to rest indoors, she had wandered up here again and saw Farrer standing at the corner of the barn, looking very hard at her. She thought he was waiting for her to come up, but before she got close to him, he had disappeared, and she did not see which way. She hastened past the front of the barn, ran round to the back, and there he was. He stood near the steps looking out for her, waiting for her, as it again seemed, and was gazing at her with the same fixed stare. But again she missed him before she could get quite up, and it was at that moment that I arrived on the scene. I went all round the barn, but could see nothing of Farrer. It was an extraordinary thing where he could have got to. Inside the barn he could not be. It was securely locked, and there was no appearance of him in the open country. It was, so to say, broad daylight yet, or at least not far short of it. The red light was still in the west. Beyond the field at the back of the barn was a grove of trees in the form of a triangle, and this grove was flanked by Crab Ravine, which ran right and left. Crab Ravine had the reputation of being haunted, for a light was sometimes seen dodging about its deep descending banks at night that no one could account for. A lively spot altogether for those who liked gloom. "Are you sure it was Farrer, Maria?" "Sure," she returned in surprise. "You don't think I could mistake him, Master Johnny, do you? He wore that ugly sealskin winter cap of his tied over his ears, and his thick gray coat. The coat was buttoned closely round him. I have not seen him wear either since last winter. That Farrer must have gone into hiding somewhere seemed quite evident, and yet there was nothing but the ground to receive him. Maria said she lost sight of him the last time in a moment, both times in fact, and it was absolutely impossible that he could have made off to the triangle or elsewhere, as she must have seen him cross the open land. For that matter, I must have seen him also. On the whole, not 2 minutes had elapsed since I came up, though it seems to have been longer in telling it, when before we could look further, voices were heard approaching from the direction of Crab Cot, and Maria, not caring to be seen, went away quickly. I was still puzzling about Farrer's hiding place when they reached me, the squire, Todd, and 2 or 3 men. Todd came slowly up, his face dark and grave. "I say, Johnny, what a shocking thing this is." "What is a shocking thing?" "You have not heard of it, but I don't see how you could hear it." I had heard nothing. I did not know what there was to hear. Todd told me in a whisper, "Daniel Farrer's dead, lad." "What?" "He has destroyed himself. Not more than half an hour ago. Hung himself in the grove." I turned sick, taking one thing with another, comparing this recollection with that, which I dare say you will think no one but a muff would do. Farrer was indeed dead. He had been hiding all day in the three-cornered grove, perhaps waiting for night to get away, perhaps only waiting for night to go home again. Who can tell? About 2:30, Luke McIntosh, a man who sometimes worked for us, sometimes for Old Coney, happening to go through the grove, saw him there and talked with him. The same man, passing back a little before sunset, found him hanging from a tree, dead. McIntosh ran with the news to Crab Cot, and they were now flocking to the scene. When facts came to be examined, there appeared only too much reason to think that the unfortunate appearance of the galloping policeman had terrified Farrer into the act. Perhaps, we all hoped it, had scared his senses quite away. Look at it as we would, it was very dreadful. But what of the appearance Maria Lease saw? At that time, Farrer had been dead at least half an hour. Was it reality or delusion? That is, as the squire put it. Did her eyes see a real, spectral Daniel Farrer, or were they deceived by some imagination of the brain? Opinions were divided. Nothing can shake her own steadfast belief in its reality. To her it remains an awful certainty, true and sure as heaven. If I say that I believe in it too, I shall be called a muff and a double muff. But there is no stumbling block difficult to be got over. Farrer, when found, was wearing the sealskin cap tied over the ears and the thick gray coat buttoned up round him, just as Maria Lease had described to me, and he had never worn them since the previous winter, or taken them out of the chest where they were kept. The old woman at his home did not know he had done it then. When told that he died in these things, She protested that they were in the chest and ran up to look for them. But the things were gone.